I am so happy to have as my guest today my very dear friend Steve Butler. Steve is representing the Schmetz Needles Company. Steve, welcome to the show.
Well, Martha, thank you very much. I always enjoy the opportunity to be able to talk to people about needles, because needles is such an important aspect of what we do in all of our sewing projects.
Absolutely.
And everything. And what I've learned is, working over the years with sewing machines, with needles, and with threads, is that the needle is really the most crucial element of all three of them, and I can tell you why.
Very interesting.
We can actually take any machine, a tired machine that really needs to be adjusted, and we can put on that a very low quality, inexpensive thread, but if we put a nice sharp needle in that machine, where chances are we're going to be able to sew all right. Unfortunately, the converse isn't true. We could take a beautiful brand new machine, just adjusted right off the technician's bench, set it down and thread it up with a high quality thread. But if we have an old or a bent needle in that, then chances are we're going to have some problems.
Okay.
The thing we need to remember is we should always sew with a clean, well-adjusted machine. We should always use quality thread products, and we should also make sure we always have a quality needle that's in good condition. The bottom line is, if we're sewing with a bad needle, we're going to have bad results. And unfortunately, also, many times people think that these results are a result of the machine or the thread and not necessarily the needle, which is so easy for us to change. If you'd like, I can cover some of the problems that we have.
Oh, I would love to, Steve. I'd love to hear it, because I know how critical a needle is.
Well, one of the first things that we see when people are sewing and having problems with sewing is they get the frayed threads or the broken threads. As you know, when we're sewing, the thread actually ratchets through the eye of the needle. If the eye of the needle is too small, or if it's deformed through use or for some kind of damage, it actually puts more pressure on that thread, more friction, and frays it, and will actually break it. Another problem we have is sometimes our needles become bent, and that's through use, or it can be because of some type of damage like hitting a pin or a zipper or something like that that we're sewing on. When that occurs, when this is bent, when we start to sew, as the needle enters the fabric, it actually deflects. And if it deflects away from our sewing hook, then we start getting skip stitches, which a lot of people think they have a timing problem, but it's really just a needle problem. Another problem we can have if the point is bent is that we get uneven stitches and we get crooked seams, and those are things that bother us a lot. Probably the last one I want to talk about is if we're using the wrong point on our needle, or the point is dull because of use, then what happens is, as the needle actually enters the fabric, instead of piercing the fabric cleanly, it pulls the fabric and gives our stitch a very puckered appearance. As it continues on through, it actually tears the fabric and leaves lots of little fibers in the bottom of our machine, destroying our fabric for us. So the bottom line is, if you're using a bad needle, you have bad results. It's all can be repaired by making sure that we have a good, clean needle in our machine.
Okay, question.
Okay.
How often should needles be changed? Whatever needles we're working with, how often should they be changed?
Well, it's interesting. It all depends on what you're sewing on. If you're sewing on heavy denim fabrics, canvas fabrics, the needles wear a lot quicker, or even quilting. If we're just doing piecing on a quilt or heirloom sewing, the needles can last a little bit longer. Unfortunately for us, we cannot look at a needle and determine if it's perfectly straight. We can put our finger underneath and touch the needle, and it might even prick our skin, but we can't tell if it's sharp enough to pierce the fabric like it should. So what we need to do is just make it a matter of habit to change the needles at routine intervals, probably 4 to 6 hours of sewing time. When you figure if you sew for 6 hours at an average of 500 stitches a minute, you're close to 200,000 stitches.
Oh my goodness, with one little needle.
That's a lot of work for that little needle to do. And so that's one of the good things that we need to look for in the needle, is make sure we just change it. Needles cost probably $1 each, something like that. So it's the very best, easiest way to make sure that we have a good needle. Another thing you want to do to make sure you have a good needle is just use a quality needle. You can spend
Absolutely.
You can just spend a few minutes online and find any number of companies around the world that stamp out needles by the millions at very ridiculous prices. But these needles aren't always the same length, the eyes aren't always the same size. So what I would recommend is that you find a good quality needle and stay with that needle throughout what you're going to use. One of the last things that we need to make sure we do is use a needle that has the right size and the right point on it. The size on a needle is basically a measurement of the shaft. We take the shaft, we measure that in millimeters and multiply it times 100. The reason we do that is, for example, a size 80 needle is really 0.8 millimeters wide. We don't want to go into a store and ask for 0.8. It's just easier to say, give me an 80. So they multiply it
80, sure.
times 100. Now, researchers have told us that the eye of the needle should be 40% larger than the diameter of the thread.
Oh, okay.
Now, the reason for that is, remember I mentioned previously that the thread ratchets back and forth through there. If the eye is that much larger than the thread, it reduces the friction on that thread and allows it to sew much better, and you don't end up with frayed threads, you end up with nice, smooth stitches. Well, none of us at home have micrometers. We're not going to be measuring the eyes of the thread or the needle, and we're not going to be measuring the thread. But what we do know is that a size 80 needle works perfectly with the 40 weight thread. So if we're going to use heavier threads than a 40 weight thread, we just need to use a larger needle. If we're going to use thread weights that are lighter than a 40 weight thread, like your heirloom sewing,
like the 60 and 80 weight threads.
The 60 and 80 weight threads, then we can go down to a 75 and 80, or 75, a 70, or even a size 65 needle, just to make sure that sews. But it's absolutely essential that we have an eye that is large enough for that thread that actually protects the thread for us as we sew.
That is fascinating. And Steve, I know that we used to think, I mean, long time ago when I was in high school and as a young bride, you got a new needle when the needle broke. Well, that's a joke.
That's right. Well, a lot of people...
I know better than that now.
A lot of folks still do that. And I can't tell you how many sewing machines I've repaired and how many sergers I've repaired simply by replacing the needles. Because people come in and they're having skip stitches and they're frayed threads and they think it's a timing problem. But all I do is take the old needle out, put a new needle in, and it sews perfectly.
Well, that would be one of the first things to try then. If there's something wrong with the machine, would you say?
Replacing a needle or making sure that you have good quality needles is absolutely the surest, fastest, easiest way to improve the quality of every stitch and the satisfaction from every sewing experience. So if you are spending the time and effort and money to work on any type of project, whether it be quilting, heirloom sewing, or home deck, making sure you have a perfect needle is the perfect way to start that project.
And that is certainly an inexpensive way to have these fabulous sewing machines that we have today, not to try to cut corners with using a needle longer or thinking, oh, well, it couldn't be the needle, because it could be.
And more times than not, it's a problem with the needle. If you've been using that needle for some time, or if you've hit a pin or you hit some other object when you're putting the needle in, it actually damages the needle. So what I recommend is, if you have any question at all, throw the needle away, put a new needle in, and you start with that, you can have a beautiful sewing project when you're finished.
Well, that is completely fascinating. And another thing I know, that I don't think there's a sewing machine manufacturer in the world that suggests sewing over pins.
No.
It's such a temptation, but
it happens.
Oh, well, and I think then we change needles when we sew over pins.
That's right.
Steve, thank you so much for being here today. It's certainly been my pleasure to have you share this critical information about needles.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And now I have a so quick, so easy project for you.